Well, TBI stands for traumatic brain injury. And so if somebody has an accident, let's say, and suffers a blow to the head, they may suffer what is called a traumatic brain injury. There are many different types of traumatic brain injuries. Somebody could have a bleed in their brain. You may have heard the term subdural hematoma or subarachnoid hemorrhage. Those are bleeds in the brain. Sometimes it is some other type of injury to the brain that is a little bit less visible or something that we can't see as well. So traumatic brain injuries can obviously be terrible to experience and have to live through. They've broken down traumatic brain injuries into three separate categories. And one of the categories, the most extreme category, is called severe TBI. Now, somebody who has a severe TBI, they are somebody that you would anticipate would be wheelchair bound. They may not be able to speak. They may not be able to see. They may not be able to hear. They may not be able to walk. So somebody who has a severe TBI, you would notice right away that something is very, very, very different about that person. Somebody who has a moderate TBI, also, you're going to notice a lot of different things. They tend not to be as responsive. They tend to have irregular movements with their body. They can't walk normally. They can't talk normally, even though they have the ability to talk. It will often be a word salad or something incomprehensible. So moderate TBIs are also very, very significant injuries. And if you saw somebody with a moderate TBI, you would know that there was something that was off about that person and that person had some sort of very, very significant injury. The final category is mild TBI. And mild TBI is injuries where you wouldn't anticipate the person to be in a wheelchair, okay? You have a blow to the head. And mild TBI, the typical symptoms that we see are some memory loss. We see loss of executive function. We can see anxiety. We can see depression. And MTBIs definitely need treatment, and MTBIs need care. For certain people, it can be a life-changing, life-altering injury. And here is why. Back in the old days, they thought that people that had what they called MTBIs, mild traumatic brain injuries, often a concussion or something of that nature, that within 3 months of that injury, most people would be fully recovered. They're now finding from the scientific studies that as many as 50% of the people that suffer mild traumatic brain injuries have lifelong cognitive deficits. And by cognitive, meaning learning issues. So let's start with a case back in, it wasn't a law case, but it was a medical case. Back in 1848, there was a guy named Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage had, during his work, literally a metal rod go through his skull. But it didn't go like through the center of his skull, kind of just grazed and went through the side of his skull. And he had some convulsions after, but basically he was able to talk within minutes of the accident happening. He was conscious. He was speaking with the doctor miraculously, and he was able to physically recover from the injury. The thing was that they realized as a result of this injury that even though he could talk and he could walk, that he was not the same person. And they started going around the town calling him no longer Gage. That was his name, Phineas Gage. So now his name was Phineas no longer Gage. And that's because he turned into a different person. This was a devoted, very intelligent foreman on a job. And after this injury, he had issues controlling his emotions. He had issues regarding his cognitive function. He had issues regarding his memory. And his employers said, well, even though he's still physically capable of doing the work, he's such a different person, we can no longer employ him. And he ended up going through a variety of jobs in his life. and I actually ultimately died of epilepsy, which probably was due to the trauma to the brain to begin with. So that's the first finding where you see somebody who would be diagnosed as having a mild TBI because he wasn't wheelchair bound, he could talk, but that he had these injuries to the brain. And that's kind of your first case where somebody, they didn't call it a mild traumatic TBI back then, but that's essentially what it was. So what happens to the brain? What is going on that is causing these problems for people that suffer from mild TBIs? Well, a couple of different things are occurring. I'm going to give you the example rather than a rod going through someone's head, because that's obviously very unusual. But let's talk about a bicycle accident where a car hits a bicycle, and the bicyclist, even though he or she is wearing their helmet, they fall to the ground and they smack their head on the ground. All right. So the first thing that you have is you have the blow to the head itself and the injury to the point where the first impact is to whatever portion of the head that is. So if it's the back of the head, that's the initial blow. If it's the front of the head, that's the initial blow. All right. As a result, there is what they call a coup contra coup effect. And what that means is coup is the blow. All right. So you get that first blow, but as a result, the brain is sitting inside the bones of your skull and the brain moves. So if, let's say, you hit the back of your head, well, now the front of your brain is now hitting the inside of the front of your skull, and you were literally getting a second blow to the head, even though there's only been one blow to the head, but now you have two blows to the brain. But there's a third problem that goes on when you have this type of injury. So you probably have heard the term gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is basically where all the information is processed and stored. It's like the CPU of your computer. That's the gray matter. The white matter is essentially the electronic cabling or the wiring, if you will, of your brain. It's what transports the information throughout your body, through your brain, and in the brain and throughout the body. So that's the white matter of the brain. So what happens when you have this type of blow is that the white matter can be damaged. What they call that is axonal shearing. So the nerve cells, and you probably heard the word axons when you studied biology, they cover these nerves. And so if you stretch or you tear or you rip these axons that have this white matter, you may very well end up with significant cognitive losses, because the stretching and the tearing, now the wiring is a little messed up in the brain. So what we often see with MTBI patients, first of all, is there seems to be a lot of commonality as to what happens. Number one, most TBI patients experience some sort of loss of consciousness. And that loss of consciousness could be as short as a minute or even 30 seconds. It doesn't need to be a long time. And in fact, in the mild TBI cases, it tends to be 30 minutes or less. So that's one of the things that we would be looking for in an MTBI, is whether it was a short window of loss of consciousness. That's one. Number two, you have the potential for amnesia. Most or many MTBI patients do not remember their accident, okay, or what happened in the events leading up to the accident, or sometimes what happened post-accident. So usually there's some sort of amnesia. That's also a telltale sign as to whether somebody's going to have an MTBI. So as a result of all of these things, you have the blow to the brain itself, you have the contra coup, the other blow to the other portion of the brain, and then you have this axonal shearing, which is affecting the white matter of the brain. So what happens to people that have these MTBIs? Well, like we said, 50% of them probably do recover without incident. They're just going to have the typical concussion stuff that you would hear about, headaches and, dizziness and vomiting, but all very, very short term. In the unfortunate section of people that have longer term issues, have what they call chronic issues, there are many, many of them. Okay. The most common ones that we see with MTBI are memory loss. That's number one. For whatever reason, the temporal lobe is one of the portions of the brain. You have the frontal lobe, you have the temporal lobe, you have the parietal lobe, you have the occipital lobe, and you have the cerebellum. And they all do different functions. So when you have these types of injuries, if there's an injury, let's say to the temporal lobe of the brain or the white matter of the temporal lobe of the brain, well, that's an area that controls memory and storage of memory. And it's very important that we get our information that's going into our short-term memory into our long-term memory. This is how we learn new things. So it becomes very, very important. People that have memory loss have developed learning issues, and also they have to deal with the memory loss. You lose your keys, you lose this, you lose that. Now everyone forgets things now or then. For people that have MTBIs, this is a constant problem. Another area where we see losses are what they call executive function. And executive function basically is all of the things that we do to plan our lives and to motivate ourselves. So when we wake up in the morning and we say, okay, I got this plan, I got this plan, I got this plan, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. The multitasking, all of those things require executive functioning. People that have an injury to the area of the brain that affects executive functioning, which is the frontal lobe, those people have difficulty being motivated, being organized, controlling their impulses. All the things that allow us to live a normal day-to-day life become much more difficult for somebody who has been impaired by an MTBI. And then there are all sorts of emotional issues. Just like the no longer gauge, he was very quick to be angry when he was used to be a very calm person. These are very, very common symptoms for somebody who has an MTBI. You have irritability, you have anxiety, you have depression. Now, some of it can be from the brain injury itself. Some of it can be from the emotional reaction to the fact that you have the brain injury. So it compounds it. So you have anxiety, depression, loss of sleep. These are all common conditions. So really, an MTBI for many people is anything but mild. I'd much rather have a broken arm than to have to deal with a long-term MTBI. MTBI would be a much more life-altering condition. Well, first of all, if it turns out that you want to pursue a personal injury claim and you want to speak to a lawyer about this, make sure that you tell the lawyer everything that happened, because all these little details become very, very, very important, especially in MTBI. Why? Because insurance companies are very, very skeptical, okay? It's not a matter of we believe your case until we, think otherwise. It is, we don't believe you have a case unless you prove it to us. And with something like a broken bone, well, that's easy. You can show them the x-ray and the treatment and the cast and all of that. But for MTBI, it's much more difficult. The problem often with MTBI patients is that other people don't realize how injured they really are because they don't look like they're injured. So if you have someone with a severe TBI, well, everyone knows they're in a wheelchair, they're not talking. They're going to get the care and the sympathy from all the people around them because it's very obvious. But with someone with an MTBI, you could just be like, why is this guy acting so crazy? What's wrong with him? He used to be a nice guy. And not knowing that there is a significant brain issue going on. So one of the most important things, obviously, if suspect that you have had any sort of TBI, is you have to get medical treatment. All right. And in order to do that, if you have not already been to the hospital, although many people who've had a TBI probably were taken to the hospital, if you lose consciousness, often that's the situation. But if not, you need to immediately get to a doctor, and hopefully they'll get you to somebody who's a specialist in neurology to possibly help. And there are things that people can do to improve their losses from a mild TBI. So they have all of these training things and they can improve your memory, and they work. They really, really work. So the most important thing is you want to get an earliest start on this as possible. The sooner you start to address it and the earlier you start to address it, the more likely that you're going to get a good physical outcome. Now, unfortunately, getting back to the insurance companies, the problem with MTBI is that often doesn't show up on an MRI or a CAT scan, okay? Because this axonal shearing, let's say, or the brain being bumped around and whatever happened to the brain, those things don't show up on MRIs. So insurance companies who are already skeptical, now they see an MRI and the MRI could very well be completely negative, even though this person is having these very, very profound symptoms. So my suggestion would be that if you are pursuing an MTBI and you really have a significant MTBI case, you have to get some sort of testing that will objectively show the injury. And lately, they've been coming up with new tests that can do that. So one of those new tests is called diffuse tensor imaging. So essentially, it's a sophisticated kind of MRI, if you will, where you go into an MRI tube. And what they do is, we discussed gray matter and white matter before. Well, gray matter, the way the blood and everything flows with gray matter, it's what they call diffuse. It just kind of spreads all over the place. But with white matter, because you have these axons that go around the cell, the information is being sent in one direction, almost like through a tube. So when they do this diffusion tensor imaging, what they use is they use water to see whether the water is diffusing. That means that the white matter is not doing what it's supposed to do, which is supposed to send it in a unidirectional direction, not spread out all over the place. So the more that we see the spread in this diffusion, the more that we become convinced that there is an injury to the brain. And so that's one of the tests that they use, this diffusion tensor imaging, to determine whether there's a brain injury. And now they have other tests that they're using to determine the amount of atrophy in certain amounts of, in parts of the brain. So atrophy essentially is the death of cells. And in this case, we're talking about the death of brain cells. So they're able to use a computer mapping software that can determine where they see cell death. And a good lawyer can then match up the areas of damage from this diffusion tensor imaging and the areas of atrophy from these other type of software tests. And they can then say, listen, we now see this portion of the brain. Let's say the temporal lobe is injured. And sure enough, this person who has a temporal lobe injury is having memory and hearing issues. And of course, that's what's controlled by the temporal lobe. So you can put one and one together and then convince a very skeptical insurance company that this is in fact a very serious injury. So my advice to anybody who has a head injury from an accident is get medical treatment right away. And if it is your wish, you should see a lawyer who is well versed in MTBI and knows how to prosecute these types of cases.